Okay, I'd like to give you a sample citizen science presentation just to give you sort of what I'm looking for in this group presentation. I'm going to be presenting some work I did in Japan. I took a class there to teach urban ecology at Lakeland University, Japan last summer, and I surveyed a bunch of sites in Japan using eBird, and then I contrasted those sites that differed in their degree of urbanization. Some were pristine or relatively pristine, or at least restored nature preserves. There were a lot of urban parks, some that were more green, some that were a lot of urban and a little bit of green space. And then we had some highly urbanized places, and it made an interesting comparison for the bird species that were there. I used eBird as a database for this and Merlin to help me identify some of the birds. And this contributes to citizen science. It adds to our eBird database. It adds to the understanding of the effects of urbanization on birds. Hopefully I'll get some conclusions. I saw this as a pilot study for something I wanted to do a little bit more in detail in the future. So it's an example of what might be similar to what you might do. It's based on Rob Blair's pioneering studies on urban gradients and birds. Rob Blair examined the birds that were found in a nature preserve, in an open space area, kind of a park-like preserve, but it was open to the public. A golf course, mostly lawn, some trees, residential area, mostly houses, but with some trees and lawn and things like that. A research park, which is getting a little more urbanized. A few trees, a little bit of green space, but not as much, and then a downtown business district. And he did this in two places, in California and in Ohio, and kind of compared what he found across the gradient. As you can see here, the number of species, and this is from the California study, was highest at urban intermediate levels of urbanization, so the golf course, open space, those sort of areas. He also looked at the community composition within these areas. So bird diversity, as I said, was highest at intermediate levels of urbanization. Bird abundance was also highest in these intermediate levels, the residential, the golf course, the open space. And he found that the bird community composition shifted from urban avoiders in the nature preserve. Suburban adaptable were pretty common in many different places, or were found kind of in the middle. And then the urban exploiters loved urban habitats, occasionally found in some other habitats, but mainly in those urban, well-developed habitats. And this was the case for both Santa Clara and for Oxford, Ohio. In the California set, it was a different set of species than you'd find in Oxford, Ohio. The data shown here are from Ohio. He found that in the reserve, there were unique species, especially the Acadian flycatcher. In the middle, he found things like northern cardinal, pretty adaptable, found in most habitats, but especially abundant in the middle. And then things like the house sparrow, found as an urban exploiter. So I think we have this sense of how the bird community can change across this urbanization gradient. He also found that the number of species that were found only in the native woodland, for this one I'm showing the California data, the ones that were found in the native woodland, the species tended to decline as you got more and more urbanized. There were a couple of exceptions, like the dark-eyed junco found in the office park, but in general you get fewer and fewer of those the species that need really good habitat. You'd find them fewer and fewer in the office park and the business district. So I wanted to compare this for Japan because lots of areas of Japan are highly urbanized, and yet there are also a lot of rural areas. So we picked areas where we could get kind of a gradient among this. So I examined it in Tokyo. We were there most of the time, so most of the sampling was done there. We have a few sites in Kyoto and a few sites in Nara, which we visited each of those for about a day, day and a half. I wanted to use eBird to document my observations, and I wanted to kind of compare these trends across that gradient of urbanization from the site that we're in now as one of the nature reserves. You can see little spots of green here that crop up in certain parks and things like that. And then you can see areas that are highly urbanized, lots of impervious cover, buildings and pavement. So in Japan, I conducted 22 observations that were complete, where I was able to identify all of the birds and report all of the birds that I saw. And these were observations that were more than 15 minutes in length. In doing it, I found that shorter observations, it was sort of hit or miss whether you saw them. But in general, if you saw the birds for 15 minutes, you got a good idea of most of the birds that were there. I sampled 19 sites. 3 of the sites were sampled twice, and for those I kind of averaged them for comparison. The average number seen during each sampling site, the average number of species seen during each sampling site. And then I recorded the data using Cornell Laboratories eBird with Merlin Bird to help identify them, mostly the step-by-step identification, and I also used field guides to help identify the birds that were there. For the sites, I had 4 that were highly urbanized, lots of buildings and pavement, little bit of green, but not very much at all. Mostly impervious surfaces. I had 4 sites that were what I would call mostly urbanized, but with some green space. So this might be a park that has a museum in it, and then some buildings and a monument and some pavement there and some gravel. And then it's got a little bit of green spaces and some trees. So it's a little bit of an oasis in the midst of an urban green space. And I'll show you some examples of these in a little bit. Then I had 8 parks that were urban parks, primarily green habitat. Lots of lawn, so this is not native habitat. It's manicured, it's human dominated, but it's still green space, and there's a lot of trees in these areas. And then we had sampled in 3 nature reserves. They differed pretty dramatically in their composition, but those were the only ones where I could truly say this is habitat that's been set aside for wildlife. So some examples, a highly urbanized area might be like this downtown area with a clear view of the Tokyo Tower. We're walking around in buildings and in highly urbanized areas along streets, near train stations, but yet you can still see there's some tree plantings, there's some urban street trees in these locations. Others are more urban, but some green. So this was a long, skinny strip park as one example of this. This is somebody else's photo, but I visited this one when it was a lot more lush and green. I just forgot to take a picture. Buildings on each side, lots and lots of domination by the area. The stream that was there was concrete lined, just to give an example. But yet it had some grass. It had some trees. It had some flowing water that had ducks in it. So more urban, but some green. Then urban park, mostly green. So the Shinjuku Goen National Gardens are a good example of this. Clearly manicured, lots of lawn, lots of trees, lots of human impact, but yet it's some green space. It's an urban oasis for wildlife. And then we have a nature reserve. This is the Tokyo Port Wild Bird Park. It contains some restored native habitat, marsh grasses, things like that. Interesting place to observe birds, and we enjoyed our time there. Other ones, there was one in Kyoto and one in Nara to be able to make these comparisons. So we basically picked the areas that were as pristine as possible, but close to the other areas. Our results, After making these observations and tallying them and then averaging the conclusion, I found that the highly urbanized area in general had a lower species richness. So this is the average number of species seen per observation compared to the other sites. It looks like there's more in the nature reserve, but this number was variable between the different nature reserves. So that's not significantly different from the urban parks and the urban green spaces. So increased species richness in the intermediate areas and in the nature reserves, lower species richness or diversity in the highly urbanized areas. For mean abundance, we saw the highest abundance of birds in the urban green spots. More urban than not, but some green available. We tended to see a lot more birds, and this included things like rock pigeons and Eurasian tree sparrows. It included a lot of the urban adaptable ones and the urban exploiters, but they seem to be there in a higher abundance. Very low abundance just in the highly urbanized spots without a whole lot of green space. And then the urban parks that were mostly green in the nature reserves had kind of an intermediate number of birds seen per minute. We also saw a bit of a shift in the community composition. The birds that are seen here are mostly were seen in the nature reserves, or the blue rock thrush was seen in one of the suburban parks, a very green suburban park. The suburban adaptable ones tended to be found in multiple habitats. They were in urban areas. We also saw them occasionally in the reserves. Lots of them seen in, I think we saw the brown-eared bulbul in just about every type of situation you could see, and the same thing with the carrion crow. The gray herons, if there was water, you might see one, you might not. They could utilize these spots. Same sort of thing with the spot-billed duck. We didn't see them in the heavily urbanized areas, but pretty much everywhere else. And then the urban exploiters, carrion crows frequently seen in urban areas, white-cheeked starlings frequently in the urban green spaces, and Eurasian tree sparrows, rock doves also fit into this category. Now, if you look at the species from the nature reserve where they found elsewhere, you see, like Rob Blair saw, we saw a pretty good drop-off. But many of the birds that were suburban adaptable were also found in highly urbanized spaces. They're kind of utilizing the space that's available there. So in conclusion, species richness was lowest in the highly urbanized areas. Species abundance was highest in the urban areas with some green space, and was lowest in the highly urbanized area. Urban avoiders, suburban adaptable, and urban exploiters, we saw birds that fit each of these categories like Rob Blair saw. It was really interesting because if you would go to a park and you saw that it was mostly developed and there was not a whole lot of green space there, you knew which cast of urban exploiters you were going to get in those spots. The species seen in the wildlife refuge tended to be seen less frequently in the urbanized spaces, especially the very urbanized spaces. And we were able to use eBird data from other citizen scientists. This data is freely available, and so I think if I was able to add that in and not just have it be my spot observation one time, but many people's observations, I could come up with better conclusions for how urbanization impacts birds. And the citizen science data are freely available. And ultimately, more research is needed, or at least I need another trip to Japan. So that's my conclusion. Here are my references, the 2 Blair articles, and then the photo sources are listed here. Okay, now to put this in context, again, you're working in groups of 2 to 3. I think mostly I've kept it to 2. You've picked a project already, that's done. You're in the process of collecting data. Some of you might be finishing that up this week. and you're going to graph your findings or present them in a table or some sort of trend, so that we can see the conclusions that you're making. You might show pictures from other sources, cite your sources, but you want some sort of visual display of what your results were. You're going to present your findings to the class on the last day. I would say shoot for 10 minutes as maximum based on how many groups there are. You're not going to have as much data as I had. I really worked hard to get to this. I was able to present the meat of my discussion within 14 minutes. And again, I had a little bit more to present. It was a little more elaborate. So you ought to be able to finish in right around 10 minutes, and then plan on 2 or 3 minutes for questions. You can choose to submit your data to the citizen science organization. If you did one of the photo identification ones, you've done that. You're contributing your expertise, or at least your observations, to this. And then here are the recommendations that I would have. It's usually good to frame it like a scientific paper. There's an introduction where you kind of introduce what you're doing and what the topic is, give your methods. What did you do to investigate this? How did you do the water tests? How did you make your observations? How many sites did you have? And then what were your results? What did you see? How did the water quality compare among the 3 sites that you compared? And then ultimately you'll give this as a conclusion. Now, when you're presenting, you want to be comfortable and you want to be able to explain it to your classmates. Don't just read the text off the slides, okay? Do not put massive paragraphs on the board and then just turn around and face the board and read them. It's okay to refer to the other screens in the room to help you to kind of coach you along as you're doing the presentation, but you do not want to read it off word for word from the slides. Your grade will not be good if you only read the text off the slides. I recommend bullet points or some sort of thing where it helps you to say, these are my main points. You're going to elaborate more on that, just like I'm doing right now, but you want to have the main outline listed on the slide. Your note cards, if you have note cards, they should only contain the bullet points and a couple of key points. Do not write everything out on the note cards and stare at your note cards and read them all word for word. That's not a good presentation style. You want to make eye contact with the audience. You want to interact with them. Generally, I would say less is more. Less text per slide. Now you can see I had a lot of information on mine, but I had a lot of stuff to present, but I didn't list all the details. I just had bullet points to kind of convey this. In general, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you want to let an image or graph help you tell your story. So if you have that, that's why near the end I put those pictures of these were the birds I found in the as the urban avoiders. These were the birds that were suburban adaptable. These were the birds that were urban exploiters, because it helps me to be able to explain that by having that as a visual aid. So let the graphs tell your story and cite your sources. If you rely on a source for an image or lift it off the internet or whatever, don't just say, oh, the internet. You have to give the specific URL for that. If you're tying it to some sort of investigation or some other sort of study that's done this before, or you want to say for your conclusions, another scientific study found the same thing that I did, cite your sources like I did for the Rob Blair papers. So there you go. I hope that helps.